as you are joining for the event, please go ahead and make sure that you're muted. You might have better reception if you keep your video off. That's perfectly okay for the event. Although we do like to see bright, shiny faces, and it's nice to all be together. So thank you, Nagisa, and everyone who's joined us tonight for this really exciting conversation with Mark Bittman. Bittman is a true public intellectual and a thought leader on food. He's written dozens of books, including seminal cookbooks like How to Cook Everything, How to Cook Everything Vegetarian, How to Bake Everything. He's a journalist who's written for the New York Times for 30 years, doing, again, everything from a regular column as The Minimalist and opinion pieces, as well as serving as food editor for the magazine. He's also on the radio and television and podcasts. He has an influential TED Talk. He's been a distinguished fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, a fellow at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He's received 6 James Beard Awards and an IACP award, and he's currently the special advisor on food policy at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. Today, he's with us to talk about his new book, a book that Ricardo Saldivar has said that Bittman was born to write. It's called Animal Vegetable Junk. Thank you so much for being with us today, Mark.
Great to be here, Tessa. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to this. So, Mark, this book, what you've done in this book is simply incredible. You've compressed literally my entire food studies library down into a digestible, readable, infinitely useful book. It seems to me that you've given us an insightful summation and a critique of the current food system, starting at the dawn of agriculture and then bringing us all the way up to today with COVID. Rachel Carson's book broke open the conversation about chemicals and the environment. Francis Lepay taught us how to situate our diet vis-a-vis the resources of the planet. Michael Pollan helped us to think about how we could vote with our forks, and each of them and so many others have given us bricks that have helped us to build a food movement. And what you've done here is you've put all of those bricks together to demonstrate what a really solid foundation there is now. Weaving these arguments and these histories together is quite fortifying, actually. It's not only a summative masterpiece, but you also help us to see ways forward. So again, thank you for this incredible work. We're really excited to dive in.
No, it's very flattering. Thank you. And to put me in such company is especially flattering. But yeah, let's talk about it.
Yeah. Now, you know that you're being hosted by an organic farming association. And so many of us have read the work that you're engaging with, including a book by a similar title. And I'd just like to ask you about it. So of course, Animal Vegetable Miracle. It was a book club read of ours a few years ago. And in that book, Barbara Kingsolver writes about a year that she spent with her family eating very close to home, eating within a 100-mile radius of her home. And of course, she also writes about the larger food system. And I was wondering if you could just start by telling us a little bit about your book's relationship to Kingsolver's. Of course, you're winking at her in the title.
I'm actually not. It's funny. I was thinking of Animal Vegetable Mineral, and this came to me sort of, I mean, I won't say that I might not have been inspired by Kingsolver's title, but I wasn't consciously thinking of it. So, yeah, it's not, the title was just, I just thought it was clever, and so did my publisher. Often you think of a title, you go and do the book, and in the course of doing the book, you come up with a better title. That didn't happen this time. So my publisher loved the title, we stayed with it, and yeah, but it wasn't, it's not an, I don't think it's an homage to Barbara Kingsolver's book.
Okay, then it's a mea culpa, because I'm trained as a literary critic, and so I'm always seeing allusions and references. Now, then I'd love to start with talking about some of your language in the book. So I think that as writers, you'll agree that words matter. And at one point in the book, you discuss how we talk about our farming system, and you call it, quote, extractive agriculture. And I thought that might be a good way in for you to help us to kind of see what, kind of the scope of what you're talking about in the book. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about extractive versus, other terms that you use in different places in the book, modern agriculture, conventional agriculture, industrial agriculture. What's the significance of extractive for you?
Words do matter. And I think when we call things by what they're not, really calling industrial agriculture conventional agriculture it's not inaccurate because it has become the convention, but it normalizes it. I tried to think about, for years I've tried to think about what the reality of things is like and how to best describe it. So we have spent 500 years and more. Of course, you could say this began with the Iron Age, but we have really spent 500 years and increasingly treating the riches of the earth as if they were inexhaustible. Now, we know better than that. And yet we continue to do that. And we do it not only with fossil fuel, not only with precious metals, but with soil and with land. And as organic farmers or people interested in organic farming, you all know that soil health is the most important aspect of farming. Really advanced farmers often say that they're farming for the soil. And we all know that the basis of wealth, the basis of human well-being is in part thanks to the land. So to treat the land's wealth as if it were inexhaustible is suicidal, hence the title. So extractive, exploitative. The other thing is industrial. And there's a book I quote that I'm now ashamed to say that I can't remember the title of. Well, anyway, it's called Every Farm a Factory. And basically it describes the transition of industry and what it looks like to say to turn a mill into something that's a factory, to turn a shoemaking operation or a tool and die operation into a factory. And it describes the characteristics that qualify an industry, that qualify a method of production as industrial or factory-like. And farming, as we know, made that transition in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it's only accelerated. So I think that's another important, to say industrial agriculture has become something of a catchphrase of people on our side. Industrial agriculturalists don't call themselves industrial agriculturalists, but we call them that, and it is accurate. It's an accurate description of how farming is done. It's even an accurate description of how animal farming is done in 95% of cases. We treat animals as if they were widgets. We treat the land as if it were inexhaustible. We farm, not those of us here tonight, but in general, we farm as if the soil were nothing more than a lifeless medium into which we inject chemicals, but only those needed to grow that particular crop, one crop at a time. That is industrial farming. So it is industrial, it is extractive, it is exploitative. And the difference between now and prior times, let's say the difference between now and, even while this was happening, there were people like Albert Howard who were understanding that farming was going in the wrong direction. But now we really know that there's a different and better way to do things. And we really know what mistakes have been made in bringing us to this point. And we also know, or at least we have a sense of what the consequences of not changing things for the better are. So, yeah, this is our chance in a way.
Oh. Yeah, I like imagining that. I think I've heard you talk about the book in different spaces, and you say that at least on those days you were in kind of a hopeful, optimistic moment. And I really like that spirit. There's several moments in the book where you're giving us this incredible history of how we got to where we are, and you zoom out and you do these counterfactual moment, right? You kind of give us a revisionist history. We got to a certain point with at the end of emancipation, and Sherman offers, meet with African-American troops that are fighting in the Union Army, and he says, what is it that you want? And they say, we'd like, land. And so there's the promise of 40 acres and a mule. And then of course that promise has failed. And you give us these moments of revisionist history, where you say, this is how it ended up, but this could have been a different moment. You do this right then. You say, they could have defined citizen differently after the Civil War to include Native Americans, freed slaves, women, Chinese people, who were the largest non-white immigrant group at the time. And so I'm wondering, in this kind of hopeful spirit, can you narrate for us a counter point to where we are now? So it feels sometimes like we're on a freight train, driving the soil and the earth into the ground. But you also in the book call COVID and our current moment a turning point, a possibility, a moment for opportunity. So what could the narrative be coming out of this? What's that hopeful story?
I mean, there is a sense that every few years we're presented with a kind of opportunity to turn things around, but maybe that's overly simplistic. It's funny, when you write a book, this is a little bit off track, but might be of some interest. When you write a book, you're really codifying your thoughts at that particular moment. And at some point you have to stop. Everybody who's written a book knows this, or everybody who's finished and published a book knows this. At some point you have to say, I can't think about this anymore because I'm confused, or I know too much, or I don't know enough, and I can't get it all in this book and call this book finished at the same time. So I was optimistic when I finished the book, and I'm not unhopeful now either, but I don't want to make things seem really simplistic. And it's quite likely that if we look at the long view of human history, 500 years from now, say, which in human time is a lot, but in real time is not that long, everything will be so different that it's impossible to describe anything that will have happened. But in the short term, there are some things we can do. And it's true that had feudalism ended differently, things might look different. Had slavery ended differently, things might have looked different. If the guano craze had not taken place in the 19th century, had we not developed chemical fertilizer, or not developed it for a while longer, things might have looked different, but they don't. So what might make things look different now? And I think there's two ways we have to look at things. There's ways of making industrial agriculture less intolerable, less deadly. And I think we need to do that as quickly as possible. And there's an argument that says, well, if you make industrial agriculture less horrible, it may be around for longer. And that's an understandable argument, but we must do some things to make industrial agriculture less harmful right now. So that's one side of how things need to happen, and we can talk about that in detail if you like. But the other side is building models for a better future. What are things going to look like when we are less consumerist and more cooperative? What are things going to look like when we're less industrial and more entrepreneurial? What are things going to look like when finance and profits aren't as important as well-being? And how do we model those things? So one of the ways we model them is by farming in ways that make much more sense than industrial farming. And again, this is an audience that knows all about that. But another way is is building cooperatives. Another way is working for better schools or school lunches or better procurement of food in cities. There are many, many ways in which we can work building things from the ground up that show that I think the summary is that society can be more cooperative and less consumerist, less competitive. But I still think it's important to say there are damaging aspects of it's not just agriculture, of course, but we're focusing on agriculture, and it's important to try to curb some of them as quickly as possible. So it's kind of, top down, bottom up, although it's not to imply that the bottom is any less important than the top. It is modeling on the side of modeling by people who have visions for how to do things better. And it is also hard work by those who are trying to make the worst parts of agriculture, in this case, less intolerable. So I guess, yeah, it's hard because whatever we do is going to seem in 50 years, it will seem naive or stupid or wrong, but we can only do what our studies and our guts tell us is right.
Yeah, I do want to talk more nuts and bolts about shifting away from industrial agriculture, extractive agriculture, and thinking. I've been thinking a lot about cooperatives. A lot of people that I'm talking to these days are thinking a lot about cooperatives, and so I want to get there. But I think one of the things that's really incredible about your book is the way that it identifies thought patterns that shape how we see what's possible within the food system. And so I would love for us to just take a few minutes to hear more from you on these thought patterns. And I was thinking about 3 thought patterns in particular, or framing paradigms that you ask us to shift. And I think a lot of us think in the nitty gritty, which policy are we going to advance? Where should we buy our vegetables this week? And so I do want to have that conversation, but I think spending a little bit of time thinking about the paradigms that you zoom in on in the book helps us to put all of those nitty gritty questions into a little bit of a more logical framing. And so I think one of the paradigms that you think about throughout your book is a paradigm that you call reductionism. Wendell Berry's version of this is specialization. And for both of you, it's a root cause of the problems that we face in agriculture. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about reductionism.
It's another thing that I think I've thought more about, and maybe my thinking has matured a little bit since I finished the book, or matured or become dumber. I don't know, one or the other. But it's not only as if behaviors grow out of philosophies, it's also that philosophies become justifications for behaviors. So if you look at the notion that things can be explained by what makes them up, and you don't look at the big picture, well, that's what reductionism is. So reductionism works if you're saying, here's how a bicycle works. This gear drives this chain, and this chain drives this wheel, and your power drives the pedal, which drives the first gear, and so on. And that's an accurate description of how a bicycle works. But if you have 100 bicycles on a road, there's no way to accurately describe what the pattern of that traffic is going to be. Same with behavior of a flock of birds, same with traffic, obviously, same with the human brain. You can talk about how humans are made, and every year there's advances in the study of consciousness and then brain chemistry and brain composition, but you can't explain how humans work, and you can't explain how society works. But reductionism attempts to do that. But really, in a way, it seems that reductionism, which was used to explain, let's say, white supremacy, colonialism, dominance of Western Europeans, the dominance of Western Europeans to some extent grew out of religious beliefs, but more it grew out of necessity, opportunity, greed, cruelty, and so on. And reductionism is just one of several ways of justifying that kind of behavior and explaining it. So rather than saying our behavior over the last 100 or 500 years was reprehensible, let's see what we can do about it. Instead, what was said was our behavior over the last period of time may be reprehensible, but it's really profitable. Let's try to figure out a way to explain it that justifies it. And that's called white supremacy. And white supremacy, in a way, is a form of reductionism. It really stems from Cartesian thought in a way which says that the highest form of human, the highest form of being, is the educated white male, and everybody else is the equivalent of an animal, and animals are kind of the equivalent of rocks. So it kind of divided humans into two categories, the superior and the inferior, and the only superior category was basically white European males.
Yeah, one thing that I appreciate about the book is the way that you speak very candidly about our sins of racism and colonialism in the past. You know, you tell a very full version of history, one that's perhaps more full than most high school textbooks, about land theft and colonization in early America and patterns of genocide and racist exclusivity of the term citizen, when citizens were given free land through the Homestead Act. And so I think one of the things that your book models for us is how to integrate these conversations really fully into conversations about food. Another thing.
Can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, of course.
We're all products of our times, right? If I had been writing this 10 or 20 years ago, I would have written a different book. And I'm not going to take credit for an awareness that was, I'll take some credit for being open to becoming more aware. But these are times in which white people are recognizing, to a greater extent than ever, or greater extent than ever in the last 500 years, the inherited wealth and inherited privilege that we've come to take for granted. I'm not disagreeing with you. I did talk about that candidly. I wanted to talk about it candidly, but I couldn't have done it even 5 years ago. I don't think I would have had the guts. And here's a very funny thing. This is really, I think this is, yeah, I find this amusing. In the course of writing the book, I often said to myself, am I concentrating too much on race? Am I concentrating too much on am I being too candid or even too over the top about white supremacy and about how Europeans came to dominate the world? That's where my reading and my understanding, and really everything I've learned since college, which was 50 years ago, everything has led me to believe that. But you know, when you're writing a book, you're writing for an audience and you want people to read the book or it's useless. So I kept thinking, am I being too arch? Am I being too out there? And I just told the truth as best I could. I told the story as best I could. And I thought, again, I really was hopeful that I wasn't being too over the top. And when I finished the book, I thought things had changed so much in the, say, 2 years that I was writing that book, that by the end of writing it, I thought, maybe I wasn't tough enough on race. And things had really changed so much that I went from thinking I'm being, especially for a white person, too hard on this. And then at the end, I thought, yeah, I could have hit it a little harder. So I found that, I don't know if that's an irony or not, but I found that interesting, paradoxical, I think it is.
Yeah, I mean, and well, you end up suggesting that the way forward is, not for the folks who already have power, either within extractive agriculture or even power within, say, the field of organic agriculture, to all get in a room and think about the next way forward. You say, actually, we need to listen to the voices that have been marginalized. And you point in the book to the way that being situated here in the United States, it feels like we are the global leader of food production. But in your book, you point out that the peasant food system, and you time and again when you use the word peasant, you say this is not a derogatory term in most of the world. Most of the world talks about subsistence farmers as peasant farmers. That's just the term that's used. But you point out that the peasant food system feeds 70% of the world's population on 25% of the agricultural resources. And you have to flip those numbers to talk about what the United States food system does vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So 70% of the world fed by peasant farmers on 25% of its resources. And you call us not only to recognize these the legacies of racism, colonialism, and exploitation vis-a-vis land and food, but you also call on us to listen to the voices that have been marginalized. And so I just wonder, like, how do you see that happening? Where do we start there?
That's not only about agriculture, of course. That's not a statement about agriculture. That's a statement about society. And it could be as simple as, who was it, Aristophanes? I don't know. It could be as simple as men have run the world for some number of thousands of years, and white European men in particular for the last few hundred. It could be as simple as saying women are actually the majority of people on earth and have a different way. I mean, it's a generalization, but have a different way of looking at things and thinking of things. Why not try it a different way? I mean, it could be as simple as that. But it's also that, again, a gross generalization, but white people have the most to lose by changing this. White men in particular have the most to lose by changing the status quo. And yet the status quo needs to change. So are white men going to lead that charge? It seems unlikely. I mean, there are, of course, many brilliant white men who say the right thing about many things, but that's been the case for a long time. And the status quo just marches forward inch by inch. Those in power consolidating it further and further. The oligarchical tendencies, I guess I could say the patriarchal oligarchical tendencies continue to move forward. I don't know how other leadership develops. I do know that I'm in favor of supporting and encouraging other leadership at every opportunity. It's a cliche to say this is class war, but there's a conflict here. And there's a conflict between those who have power and want to keep it, and those who are entitled to their share of it. I don't know how that change. If I could say accurately how that change would happen, I'd be the only person who knew. No one can say how that change happens. What we can say is that we want to support changes in leadership, changes in the power structure, changes in wealth holdings, changes in income inequality, changes in land ownership, which would be an interesting thing for you and I to talk about here. All we can do is speak out for that and support people who are working to do that and work ourselves to do that.
Yeah. On this note, I don't want folks to sign out thinking they're going to pick up your book and it's going to be this uplifting, optimistic text, because it's very serious about assessing the state, the history and the state of where we are. And, the idea of the consolidation, your book talks a little bit about the consolidation of wealth and power. And one of the stats that even that surprised me, even though I'm swimming in this stuff, is that you talk about that next year in 2022, fast food industry profits will reach globally $700 billion. And of course, you spend a lot of time in the book talking about what you call UFPs, ultra processed foods. But you put that $700 billion into the perspective of international capital. And you said that if the fast food industry were a country, its GDP would be ranked among the top 20 countries in the world. I think that's just kind of boggling consolidation, you know, and I recognize how ubiquitous fast food restaurants are here in the US. But when I think about that globally, I would have never guessed that stat. And I'm just wondering, like, why does this matter? What's at stake? And, you know, what should we be paying attention to as we sit here in, you know, what you call sort of the cradle of industrial agriculture that's being now exported?
Well, fast food and industrial agriculture, or ultra processed foods, junk food, to be simple as possible, and industrial agriculture are very closely tied because and they feed off each other, no pun intended. We can only eat what we grow. And what we grow is a surplus of corn and soybeans and some other commodity crops that are grown not with nourishment as their primary goal, but with profit as their primary goal. That's like one of the cardinal sins is a bad word, but that's like one of the, or a word I don't like to use. It's one of the cardinal mistakes of the way agriculture is organized and our society is organized, is that we raise food not for nourishment as its primary goal, which is what it should be, but for profit as its primary goal. And if you think about it, that's really a bad thing. That's really a horrible thing. So if you're doing that, then you just grow the crops that are simplest and easiest and have been most supported by research and development and manufacture, machinery, chemicals, and so on. And those are corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, etc. And what you make out of the surplus of those foods is what winds up getting fed to people. So this is a statistic that's true for the United States, but not for the rest of the world yet. But 60% of our calories, 60% of the calories sold in the United States are from ultra-processed foods, which means either, these are just logical extensions here, it either means that 60% of us are getting 100% of our calories from ultra-processed foods, or 100% of us are getting 60% of our calories from ultra-processed foods. And it's neither of those things, it's somewhere in between. But what it means is that there's only 40% of calories that are actually nourishing out there. So needless to say, some of us eat more of those good calories and less of the harmful calories, and some of us eat more of the harmful calories. But all of us can't eat all good calories because that's not how we're doing agriculture. And that's how, because fast food is so profitable and because industrial ag is so profitable, that's what the US wants to export. It's not just the US. At this point, it's global companies. I mean, Monsanto was a US company, and it's now owned by Bayer, which is a German company. So in fact, the major chemicals companies in the world are no longer American. But when we talk about multinational corporations now, they may have had their roots in the United States, and almost all of them had their roots in the United States and in Western Europe, but now they're global. But still, this style of agriculture and this style of doing business and doing finance originated and matured in the United States, started in the 19th century, matured after World War II, and now it's truly global. For those global companies, and we can call them big ag and big food, but we can call them big chemical, you can call them whatever you want. For those to continue to make profits at the rate they're making profits, they want to export more industrial agriculture and more junk food, more fast food, more ultra processed foods. And this has been the case pretty much since World War II, when the United States started exporting machinery, chemicals, hybridized seeds, technology, a style of farming and a style of eating from the United States, first to Western Europe and then to the rest of the world. Now it's a web and it's globalized and it goes everywhere. But the point is that the corporations that do this kind of agricultural production and food production want to have the biggest global market possible. They want to negate that statistic you used before of 70% of the food in the world still being produced by peasants doing peasant agriculture with remarkably few resources and almost no research on how to make that agriculture better compared to the amount of research that's gone into making industrial agriculture as efficient as it could possibly be. I think that's the end of the sentence. Yeah.
Well, I remember this observation about the yin and yang. If 60% of our food, our calories are in ultra processed foods, I don't eat 60% of my diet is not. So then, you had this stat that there's 150 burgers per capita per year that are made, and I was like, okay, so I think I have 5 burgers a year. So who's eating my other 145 burgers, right? Somebody. And this is one of the things that stands out to me about animal vegetable junk that's different than some of the other popular food books, the food books that have been really, with dog-eared pages and cracked bindings from being read and read and read over the last decade or so, is your book is not actually thinking about my diet very much. You're thinking a lot about this holistic vision. Who is the junk food being foisted on? And your book says that that innovation from industry is not going to fix food and diet, and neither is buying right. So I've been working on buying right. You say that both are patches on a tire with no tread. And so I'd love to hear you talk about what is going to fix food and diet, and and then I will, of course, ask you what are people's roles, but you can start pointing to, what different people can do given their different positionalities.
I think it was Wendell Berry who said, we built industrial agriculture, we can unbuild it. It doesn't mean we can unbuild it in a minute. We can each, those of us who are lucky enough to be able to control our own diet and much of our own lives, can obviously eat well and steer clear of ultra processed food to a large extent. But that is the food that's out there. It's the dominant food that's out there. So people with less control over their lives, less control over their diet, are the people who are eating it, obviously. And that it's not a coincidence that those are people with less money and less time. So what do we do to start to dismantle industrial agriculture? What are the weak chinks in the armor? Where can we attack where we're likely to have success? So I have some ideas, and I'm not sure I'm right, but I think I'm right about a couple of them at least. The first one is, because this is such low-hanging fruit, getting antibiotics out of the food supply. So I think this is a sophisticated enough audience that I don't need to say why that's important, so I won't. But it's something that the Food and Drug Administration could change like that in a week, literally, could announce that prophylactic use of antibiotics in raising animals is no longer allowed. If you have a sick animal and you want to treat it, that's fine. But you can't treat a flock just because you want to prevent it from getting sick. Now, we don't even have a commissioner of the FDA. So while that seems like low-hanging fruit, and it was low-hanging fruit when Barack Obama took office, it's still hanging there, rotting. So I don't know how realistic that is, but it seems pretty good. Another one that seems pretty low-hanging is enforce existing clean water and air regulations and strengthen them. Make carcinogenic pesticides. I mean, we've been talking about this for 60 years. Make carcinogenic pesticides illegal, or at least regulate their use effectively. which we're not doing. I mean, the UN has called Roundup the most widely used pesticide in the United States, carcinogenic. You can go buy it in the supermarket, certainly in the hardware store, without a license, without any reason to use it other than that you want to kill some weed in your backyard. I think another travesty that we almost dealt with in the 70s, and we might have dealt with had Ronald Reagan not become president, is the targeting of children with junk food. So it's not only that ultra-processed food is out there, it's that everybody, nearly everybody in the United States, thinks that they prefer to eat ultra-processed food and that it's their right to eat ultra-processed food. And that's the result of us being trained as youngsters to believe that Tony the Tiger is our friend, and Coca-Cola is the most refreshing beverage ever invented, and McDonald's is the most fun place to get your parents to take you to go eat. Now, some of us have overcome that, or we didn't learn it in the first place, or whatever, but that's what the dominant marketing is about. And we all know that many people have bought into this, not because they're dumb or anything, but because that's what they've been bombarded with from the time that they were in the womb. So children who do not know the difference between right and wrong are being told Tony the Tiger is your friend, and they're believing it. So I think that the marketing of junk to children, the marketing of junk in general should be restricted, but the targeting of children with junk food should be restricted in a hurry. I could go on, but those, if we regulated industrial farming of animals the way we ought to, there was just a study last week, and I didn't look at it carefully enough. So I'm blanking on the guy's name, and I'm talking to him later this week. So later this week, I'll be a semi-expert on this. But there was just a study that said 20,000 direct deaths in the United States every year attributable to air pollution from industrial production of animals. You probably saw this, Tessa. It's Jason, I can't remember his last name. That's 20,000 people direct. That's a number. Who knows how accurate it is? It's probably low, if anything. But there's 20,000 people there. There's 20,000 people a year dying from antibiotics that are no longer as effective as they once were. And there's more than 1 million people a year dying as a direct result of chronic disease that's driven by ultra-processed food. So we have a public health crisis on our hands that has many causes and many effects. And that's a food and agricultural issue also.
Yeah, it sure is. I actually think that what we've done is we went from hopeful to the, to the serious stuff, which we need to do. I'd like to zoom out just a little bit. If I'd like to say to folks who are in the audience, if you have a question that you'd like to ask Mark, put it in the chat. I'm going to ask him one more question, then Nagisa is going to ask maybe 1 or 2 questions from the chat before we close up. So if you have something, if your wheels are spinning, put something in the chat. We'd love to hear your thoughts. But I want us to think a little bit about New Jersey, and I'd love to just have, kind of your insight and wisdom here. One of the things that's super just wise and grounding at the end of your book is that you tell us, like, there's no master plan for the changes that we need. There's not going to be a roadmap. And and in part, that's because what you're calling for is a decentralized food system, or even many smaller food systems that are tending to communities and where people who are close to living on that land are eating from that land as well. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in there. And so when I think about our work through the Northeast Organic Farming Association of New Jersey and the work that folks in New Jersey are doing with regard to food, we are the garden state. And so we have a lot of conscientious growers who are responsible and innovative and using organic methods to produce a wide variety of things: market fruits and vegetables, grains, meats, eggs, specialty items like mushrooms. There's been some movement too to empower local processing, so milling and cheese making. If anyone on this at this event is wondering what farmers are doing those things, we have a New Jersey Food and Farm Guide, so that you can go and get connected with a farmer here in New Jersey that's using organic methods to produce all kinds of delicious food. And we even have legislation that's pending, or that would restrict the use of neonics, especially in landscaping. And if it passes, that it would be some of the most progressive legislation in the country. Cory Booker, of course, our senator, has recently introduced some really progressive legislation, including the Farm System Reform Act, that takes aim at concentrated animal feeding operations, and the Justice for Black Farmers Act, that starts to try to undo some of those historical mistakes, as you call them. In short, we're a pretty captive audience here. And so I would just love to hear a little bit of your advice for us in New Jersey. Are there other models that you have seen that are especially compelling, that we should be looking towards? Or, the piece about building a cooperative, that's kind of, we have these projects that are going on, and some folks that are starting to think cooperatively and or sort of regional system wide. But I'd just love for you to, kind of give some words to us here in New Jersey.
Well, I don't know that New Jersey, I live 30 miles from New Jersey, probably. I mean, I live just north of the Bear Mountain Bridge. So however far it is to the state line. These are geographical borders, and I prefer to think of, or these are political borders, and I prefer to think geographically, and I prefer to think about the Northeast. And I know that I'm old enough to remember pigs in Secaucus, and I'm old enough to remember Jersey tomatoes coming into the markets when I grew up in New York City. We could have those times again, but there's some other things. Let's see, random thoughts. In the 19th century, the biggest supplier of agricultural products to New York City was Maine, because boats went to Portland and trains went to Boston, and both came to New York, and Maine was an agricultural powerhouse. The Northeast is not blessed with the kind of climate that the Southeast is, obviously, or the Southwest or the Northwest, but we have a climate that has a growing season of 6-8 months a year. And thanks to Elliott Coleman and people like that, we've learned how to grow year round, and many people are doing that. I think we need to think about farming regionally. I think that small farmers do best when they organize into bigger cooperatives, into food hubs, at farmers markets, in CSAs. My partner, who runs Glenwood, which is a not-for-profit regional food organization up where I am near Cold Spring, does organizations of CSAs and organizations of apple growers and cider makers. And these are in the Hudson Valley mostly, and in New York State more broadly. But I think these are the kinds of things that are going to encourage more people to go into farming, that are going to make farming more successful. I want to say one other thing about land, which I know we're just about out of time. And actually, I will say that I always save these chats and learn a lot from them. So if you've asked a question, thank you. I will see it. We need to be able to get land into the hands of more people who want to farm it and farm it well. And that, we could talk about that and race all night long. But we could also just talk about that and the opportunity to grow better food. And I don't know how. I have ideas about how to do that. I don't know what will happen, but I think one thing that's critical to happen is that we have to move beyond nonprofits, land easements, open space initiatives, things like that, into actual land reform. where land in I don't know what amounts, but we know that there are CSAs operating on quarter-acre plots in this country. So people are making a living literally on 1 acre. Farmers are making a living on 1 acre. So if we can do land reform on the order of 1, 5, 50, and 100 acres at a time, we can build an alternative farming system that will really serve its communities. That's key to happening in the not distant future. But, again, not to put, I don't want to be negative, but the only senators, there's like 3 or 4 senators who are willing to have that conversation with you and think about those things. Cory Booker's one of them. Elizabeth Warren is another, maybe Sherrod Brown and 1 or 2 others. But this is something, we talked a little bit before about how this book would have been a different product 5 years ago and would have been different 5 years from now also. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was hard to talk about reparations. And now it's a common conversation. It's still hard to talk about land reform, but that needs to become a common conversation. The United States federal government, without getting too strident, stole land from indigenous Americans and gave it away to white European men. It has the power to start taxing that land on exchange and start distributing that land to people who've been shut out from the greatest land grab, one of the greatest land grabs in the history of the world. That's really important. I don't know how you make that happen. I don't know how to feel optimistic about that, but I do think that it's critical to think about that and talk about that.
I mean, land access is the number one roadblock to new farmers, especially here in the Northeast and New Jersey, where land prices are so expensive. There are some projects that NOFA is working on, some grants and some public works projects where we are working with public agencies to turn over public land that's been farmed conventionally or industrially or extractively over into organic production, and to create pipeline opportunities for farmers, young farmers, farmers of color, farmers from underrepresented backgrounds, to use that land at a zero-cost lease to start to kind of catapult or springboard an agricultural operation. So it's definitely something that's on our radar, and we've been thinking a lot about partnering with public lands that are currently being farmed and trying to get them to be farmed in a different way by young and underrepresented farmers who want to get a foothold in. But the issue around land, I mean, that's the number one issue here. And
elsewhere too.
But I also think that we underestimate the possibility that people would want to go from the cities into rural spaces where there is more land, right? And I think, whenever I talk to people about a return migration, right? Something that you write about with regard to kind of the African-American Great Migration and a return migration to the South to be back on land. You write a little bit about that in the book. Whenever I talk to people on the East Coast about the idea of return migration, I get this look like, oh, what are you like, why would anyone want to leave the East Coast? And so, but I think that I think that it's possible. There are those of us, I'm one of them. I live on a small farm. There are those of us who actually do enjoy working the land and would like to be on land doing this work, either for ourselves or for small communities. And I think that gets discounted. We just always think that we want to move towards whatever the idea of enlightenment progress is. And I just don't think it's all the way true.
I think there's an opportunity also to use technology to make farming, again, almost all of the research has gone into making industrial farming more efficient. Very little research has gone into helping small farmers and trying to figure out what the ideal size farm for a family or 2 families is to run and how that might run best and so on. And I think if we put energy research into that kind of farming, it's going to be less grueling than it ever was before, more enjoyable, more productive, more profitable. life sustaining, let's say, and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Mark. I'm wondering, Nikisa, is there one or two questions you'd like to share from the chat for before we?
Yes, I think there, well, first of all, let me just say, I'm putting it in the chat, but because we do have 100 people on the line, I feel compelled to do a little bit of outreach to say that we do have 550 acres from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, which is available for any experienced organic farmers. And we can make that arrangement so that people have access to that land rent-free, right? So we already have one pilot project that's about to get started. We're working with the Turtle Clan in the northern part of New Jersey, and they're going to be on the Whittingham Wildlife Management Area. They're going to lease 10 acres from the state of New Jersey, and they will not be charged any rent for 10 years. And they also have an option to renew for another 10. So while it may not be an actual return of land, I think this is about as close as we can get in our, in our new world. And so I think if anybody else is interested in this land, please reach out to me, and I will work with you to try and put you, connected to some piece of land in New Jersey. It's 550 acres all throughout the state. All right.
That's amazing, Nagisa. Thank you.
Yeah. So there are 4 questions that I have gathered from the chat. The first one, I think this might have come in before you slightly answer this question. Could you please comment on how federal policy can transform agriculture and the importance of the Farm Bill?
Well, I think I did address some of that, and I'm sorry to say I don't have time for 4 questions. I will say this about the Farm Bill. No one understands it, and anyone who says that they do is lying. So it's designed to be arcane. It becomes more arcane every time it gets passed, and I think in a way, focusing on it may be a mistake. We just need to look at what issues are important and talk about them and try to get changes made in them. If that happens to be in the Farm Bill, great, but we are not reforming the Farm Bill. And it's even risky to take on the Farm Bill because the Farm Bill is also the way that we keep the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program alive. So if you want to destroy the Farm Bill, you're gonna have to find another way to support getting food to people who can't afford good nutrition by themselves. So let's do one more question, Nagisa.
Okay. Let's see. Well, actually, the other 2 questions are about land ownership, which you definitely addressed. There's another question here. Are NOFA and Mark aware of the One Health initiative co-founded by Princeton research scholar Dr. Laura Kahn? It educates on the interconnected balance between human, animal, and earth microbial health. onehealthinitiative.com. Question.
I will look.
Okay.
Tessa probably knows.
All right. Well, I mean, I'm sure you guys were very thorough, so I'm sure that's why there are limited questions. And we're really so grateful to you, Mark, for joining us tonight. So
I'm so glad it worked out. And thank you for thinking of it and for having me. And Tessa, thanks for the great interview.
Yeah, Mark, thank you for joining us. Thanks to everyone who came to be with us tonight in the conversation, wherever you are. We're grateful to Labyrinth Books for co-hosting the event with us. You know that you can get a copy of Mark's book at Labyrinth, either in person or online, so check them out. And NOFA's been growing organic in the Garden State for 35 years. We're hoping to continue this good work. And so we've just established the Organic Future Fund. We hope you'll consider partnering with us by making a contribution. The first 25 contributors who make a donation of $100 or more will get a signed copy of Animal Vegetable Junk signed by Mark. And then just a word to say, our website is full of an amazing list of summer events, including a summer-long organic gardening course, a CSA cooking series, and a workshop on farming for a changing climate, among many others. So please check out our website and be in touch. We hope that we'll see you again. And Mark, we are so grateful that you spent the evening with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.